So what's up, guys? What we're going to be talking about today is the American Indian movement and Native American civil rights.
By Chris Mejia.
And me, Dylan. So what was the American Indian movement? The American Indian movement was a militant American Indian civil rights organization founded in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 1968. It was created by a group of people. Some of the creators were Dennis Banks, Clyde Bellecourt, Eddie Benson Benign, and George Mitchell. Here is the symbol that they used for the American Indian movement. And originally, its purpose was to help Indians in ghettos who had been displaced by government programs that had forced them from their reservation. But eventually, their new goals were to demand economic independence, revitalization of traditional culture, protection of legal rights, autonomy over tribal areas, and of course, the restoration of lands that they believed had been illegally seized by the U.S. government. In this photo, you can see the marches that the American Indian movement, also known as AIM, has attended for the 500 years of resistance against the U.S. government. Next, why was the American Indian movement started? First reason is because of high unemployment rates. The second reason is the slum housing they used to live in. The third reason is the racist treatment they face. Fourth reason is fighting for their treaty rights. The fifth reason is the reclamation of tribal land. And the last reason is to advocate on behalf of urban Indians whose situation bred illness and poverty. Here on this map shows the federal lands and the Indian reservations in the U.S. What was AIM involved in? The first thing that AIM was involved in was the occupation of Alcatraz Island from 1969 to 1971. In this photo, it shows how Native Americans were playing basketball and football in the island of Alcatraz. The second involvement was the March of Washington, D.C., also known as the Trail of Broken Treaties in 1972. In this photo, it shows how Native Americans are holding up the flag of the U.S. upside down. And the third one is the takeover of Wounded Knee in 1973. As you can see in this photo, there's a bunch of Native Americans with weapons taking over the city of Wounded Knee. Why did they protest? The occupation of Alcatraz was because the American Indians were supposed to get their sacred land back, but the U.S. never gave it to them. On the March of Washington, or the Trail of Treaties, was to demand the government to check out the Bureau of Indian Affairs, also known as the BIA, and securing an Indian future in America. Here is the symbol of the BIA. And the occupation of Wounded Knee was due to the unhappiness of the treaties that has been broken by the U.S. government. One of the treaties was Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. What did they accomplish after the things they've done? Well, the occupation of Alcatraz was unsuccessful because there were a lot of problems between each other, and the negotiations between the U.S. government and the tribes led up to nothing. While the March of Washington, also known as the Trail of Broken Treaties, was a huge success since it gained media attention and most of their demands were met. As you can see in this newspaper, it shows the media attention of the Trail of Broken Treaties. Next is the occupation of Wounded Knee, which was a success as well, with the U.S. government and AIM negotiating that the federal government will conduct a fair review of several treaties. As you can see in this photo, AIM is negotiating with the federal government.
So what we're going to be talking about next is the Native American civil rights and its early history. The Native American tribes of the United States have been fighting for their rights since the arrival of the Europeans. Then, with the arrival of the Europeans in the Americas, the way of life for Native Americans has changed forever. Then, in 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which resulted in the forced removal of the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, and the Choctaw. This photo shows how the U.S. government were kicking the 5 civilized tribes out of southeastern United States under the Indian Removal Act. Furthermore, in the early history of the Native American civil rights, when the 14th Amendment passed, it stated that all persons born in the U.S. are citizens. However, this didn't apply to Native Americans, which meant that they were not allowed to vote, even though they were born in the U.S. In 1924, the Indian Citizen Act was passed, which meant Native Americans now have full citizenship in the U.S., including the right to vote. Despite this law, some states were slow to allow Indians to vote. It wasn't until 1948 that they were allowed to vote in every state. This photo is the actual document of the Indian Citizen Act. Next, the Indian Civil Rights. The passage of the Indian Civil Rights Act, the ICRA, in 1968, also known as the Indian Bill of Rights, Native Americans were guaranteed many civil rights that they had been fighting for. Due to this act in 1968 was a big step in advancing the rights of Native Americans due to the ICRA supporting the following: rights to freedom of speech, rights to freedom of press, right to peacefully assemble, a speedy and fair trial, right to due process in a trial by jury, the right to an attorney, and etc. And this photo is the actual document of the Indian Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1968. Furthermore, improvement on civil rights. The Indian Reorganization Act was signed into law in 1934. It reversed some of the issue with earlier laws. Example, it reversed the Dawes Act policy, which authorized the U.S. president to survey the American Indian tribal land and divided it. And it renewed the rights of the Indian to form their own government. This photo on the bottom right shows the President Roosevelt signing the Indian Reorganization Act, surrounded by Native Americans. In 1970, the National Indian Education Association was formed to help improve the education of Native Americans. The bottom left photo shows the symbol of the National Indian Education Association. Now on Religious Freedom Act of 1978. The Religious Freedom Act of 1978 was enacted to protect and preserve the traditional religious rights of American Indians, Eskimos, and Aliyahs, and Native Hawaiians. Access of sacred sites, repatriation of sacred objects held in museum, freedom to worship through ceremonial and traditional rites, including within prison, including the use and possession of objects considered sacred. This photo is the actual document of the Religious Freedom Act of 1978. Last of all, the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978. The Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 requires American Indian children be placed with extended family members, other tribal members, or other Native American families for foster care or adoption purposes. The law protects the tribes interested in retaining custody of their children.